Hello, everyone. This is what your pastor didn't tell you. Today, I am on with archaeologist Phillip Webb. We're going to be talking about the United Kingdom, what the biblical stories talk about, where Solomon and King David have a huge kingdom and the riches and the area involved. The problem is the question that a lot of archaeologists have is how does this work? Because when we look at the archaeology, that's not really what we see. Are we misreading the biblical text or misreading the archaeology? You have a lot of scholars that will argue, hey, this is just a total myth, it's just made up. And you have another group of people saying, hey, well, you're just biased and we do see it. We just haven't found it yet. All kinds of really interesting, difficult questions. How are you doing today, Philip?
Doing great. Thanks for having me on. I appreciate being
Awesome.
here.
Yep. So you have a YouTube channel, which you don't post on anymore, called Beneath the Bible, but it still has a lot of awesome, really, really good videos. And what are you doing with your archaeology these days?
I'm still working in the field. Wrapped up a project on Cyprus. The project wrapped up, and I'll be helping finish that out. I'll be on a project in Jordan this summer, so be excited for that. Um, but yeah, still in the field, still working on stuff. Got a couple other irons in the fire, so keeping busy. That's for sure.
Yeah, awesome. Alrighty. So you did your dissertation specifically on the Bronze Age collapse. So this is something that happens right after that. We're talking about just for people that maybe not as familiar. So we're talking the time period, and at the very end of maybe 1500s to 1000 BC, where there's supposedly an exodus out of Egypt, and then this is after the conquest. This is after the judges time period, and then you get into King Saul, and he's like, "Hey, I'm gonna be king." And then King David comes along. He's like, "I guess I'm gonna be king now, actually." And then Solomon comes along. And then after that, after Solomon comes, everything's great. Then there's a break in the kingdoms. That's what we're kind of getting into today. You actually made a video that I kind of want to use as an illustration that was really good, that kind of summarizes what's going on. So we'll watch that and we'll kind of comment on it. You can check it out in the description for people if you want to. But Israel and Judah, from the settlement to the state.
The 10th century marks a major transition in the history of Israel and Judah. And as there was a tension between text and archaeology in the preceding settlement period, we see a similar tension in the 10th century as it pertains to early Israelite states. The Bible presents a linear development from Samuel, the last judge, to Saul, the first king, who had personal failings but had military successes on all sides. This is built upon by David, who expands the unified kingdom of Israel. And finally, Solomon rules over a golden age of Israelite imperial rule over the entire southern Levant. This ends.
Just to stop it real quick, that's a lot of area.
That's a big area.
That is a huge area compared to what we'll see in just a second here.
With his son Rehoboam, who makes foolish decisions and the kingdom is split.
Like, that is a huge difference. That's half, and then not only it's half, but it's also supposedly broken up, as at least what the biblical text is describing.
Yeah. This is what the text is. This is sort of as close as I can get to mapping out sort of what you see the Bible saying, not archaeological.
Yeah. Right.
Humiliated by an invasion from Egypt. But the archaeology of this period doesn't exactly match this narrative, leaving us to harmonize the text with the archaeology.
All right, so we have Israel at the top in the blue, and then Judah at the bottom in red. One of the big questions we are asking today is if this red and blue people groups were ever a united monarchy, like the Bible portrays it, with Saul, David, Solomon, or if something different happened. So before we get into all that, could you talk maybe about what scholars mean by united monarchy?
Yeah, there's lots of issues around what terms are used in this time period, right? What does Israel mean? What does Judah mean? What is House of David? What is all this, which we can get into? The United Monarchy would refer to when all of Israel, to use the Bible's terminology, when all of Israel is ruled by one king, like one dynastic line, one king. Because we see as the text describes it, after Solomon, it splits. Jeroboam rules in the north and Rehoboam in the south, and the house of David continues in Jerusalem. So you have that united monarchy versus divided monarchy, and there's a question as to whether all of Israel was ever really ruled from one place. And again, I think part of this issue is there's just everybody's kind of got a different take on what time period the text reflects. If that makes sense. Some people will say that this is all a post-exilic reflection or Hellenistic fabrication. There's others who will say this is accurate from the time. So depending on when you think the text was written, will kind of impact what people will argue. I don't know.
Yeah. And just for people, reminders for people. So you have David. I mean, as you're saying. So one question is, when is actually David and Solomon, if they are historical people, when they're living? So like you have a biblical chronology, but even in ancient times, there would be skipped generations, especially when you're talking about people that like we're not a billion% sure even if they existed. Like there's no like concrete historical evidence of Solomon. We could probably be more confident about David, but the David that we see in archaeology, is that the same one that we see in the Bible? And when did these people actually live? So that's one question. But a lot of people would say, okay, so it's somewhere around 1010 to 970 BCE, and then Solomon after that from 970 to 931 BCE. And as a reminder, Solomon, the Bible talks about there's all these grand building projects like the temple in Jerusalem. There's trade, wealth, administrative organization, all this before splitting after the kingdom supposedly split after Solomon's death. And so that's a lot going on. And what we're going to talk about today is, what do we see in the archaeological record? And does that mean that the Bible is wrong, or that we're just misunderstanding the archaeological record? We just haven't found it. But anything you want to add before I keep going?
Yeah. So as far as the chronology in the Bible goes, there's been a lot of there's different ways of looking at it. But Tila's the mysterious numbers of the kings of the Hebrew Bible or something like that, that's pretty close to standard. And he argues that there's co-regencies, so the numbers overlap. He argues that Israel and Judah alternate between accession year, non-accession year dating. And so like if you've ever tried to add up the numbers of the reigns of the kings, it doesn't seem to work. But there are ways of making it work, that there would be different ways of counting the years. And so I think the number we can be pretty confident in the reigns of the kings, that those are accurate. It's just how we map those onto our time. That's where issues get. But then when you get to Saul, David, and Solomon, they all have this 40-year reign. And there are a number of sort of symbolic numbers that are used throughout the ancient Near East. And 40 is one of these. Like we see in Numbers that 40 is the length of a generation. That's why they wander in the wilderness, because that's the length of a generation. So with David and Solomon, are they reigning for 40 years, or is this a sort of placeholder number for like a generation?
Mm-hmm.
And we don't exactly know why you have those sort of placeholder numbers, or you have 40. Maybe it's entirely possible that those three all reign for 40 years. There have been weirder things that happen in history, but that's what I think is probably more likely is that they just didn't, for whatever reason, they weren't keeping track of those numbers, or they, somewhere along the line they weren't keeping track of it. They lost the record. And so it was about a generation. And that's fine. That's a perfectly adequate way of doing history. So,
Yeah. I don't think I've ever, I'm not that I've never heard it. I don't hear that explanation often. Yeah, I think they just lost a record.
Well, like at what point were they keeping records?
Yeah.
What were they keeping records on? When do you see that kind of literacy in this part of the world? And so the 10th century would kind of be pushing it for that kind of record keeping. That sort of Akkadian tradition of record keeping is gone. That sort of Paleo Hebrew script exists in the 10th century. There's the Gezer calendar, which shows that there was literacy, but we don't see widespread literacy. There's not overwhelming evidence for it in the 10th century. But again, they could have been keeping records on very perishable materials, and so we just don't have it. There's still questions. You can get into the debates on literacy and record keeping, and that the tradition of writing. It's not settled.
Yeah.
Makes foolish decisions in the kingdom. But the archaeology of this period doesn't exactly match this narrative, leaving us to harmonize the text with the archaeology. The big issue being the issue of state formation. The biblical story tells us of the rise and splitting of a single large state, but the archaeological picture isn't as clear. Usually the formation of states are accompanied by material markers, a centralized bureaucracy, a large capital to accommodate it, monumental architecture, military installations for defense, and so on.
So just real quick, and I mean really quick, I don't want you to go all in depth on this, but these are some weird terms here: centralized bureaucracy, capital city. So like, what is that even? What's the significance of a capital city? That people might be questioning, and me specifically questioning. Okay, what is the significance in this discussion? Why are we looking for a capital city in this whole discussion? Why would that change the debate? Could you talk about that?
Sure. So just by centralized bureaucracy, it usually just means somewhere where records are kept. Who's paying taxes and how much? Where are the people, keeping track of people movements, keeping track of, if I need to go to war, I can levy this amount of soldiers. You got to keep track of that somewhere. So that's what we mean by like a centralized bureaucracy. And a capital city is usually would be like where this is all happening. You don't always see the bureaucracy in the capital at the same place. You can have disembedded capitals. That's a thing. But oftentimes they're at the same location. So we see this Assyria, the Library of Ashurbanipal. This is a sort of, and that's a library. It's a little bit different than a bureaucracy, but where records are kept often is usually where the king is, and where all of this is being done. Monumental architecture is often taken as a symbol of state formation, because monumental architecture really just means it can mean a lot of things, but it's a sort of conspicuous display of authority. It's architecture, buildings that are larger than what an individual or small community is capable of doing. So like fortifications are monumental architecture, palace structures are monumental architecture. And we often don't think of this, but when you're building with mud brick, you have stone foundations and mud brick, you need agricultural byproduct to build your bricks. So who is managing the flow of the economy and the agriculture to make sure all of that chaff isn't just burnt, but is collected and is being put towards the production of mud bricks, so that you can build all of the fortifications that you need to defend your state. So there's levels of these are all sort of material manifestations of complex organization. And that's what you would expect moving from, and I don't like the sort of neo-evolutionary state movement thing, but the old model of like band, tribe, chiefdom, state, which is not really accepted anymore, but as just a heuristic, you see this sort of movement towards statehood as a more complex level of organization. And you see that in a number of different ways. And these are just a few of the things that you tend to associate with statehood, that these are things that states typically do. But again, it's a lot more complicated than this sort of linear trajectory of tribe, chiefdom, state. And so what do we see in the 10th century is sort of, is it statehood? Is it something else?
Yeah, and so when we're looking at kind of what the text of Judges describes, it's a bunch of different tribes that are kind of connected but not really connected, and then supposedly Saul and David come along and unify these tribes. But obviously, there's got to be things that unify them. It's not just hey, hello, fellow neighbor.
Like when Saul chops up a bull in 12 pieces and sends it out, and that's a threat of, you are all going to come when I call, or you're going to be like this bull. There's usually a level of not everybody goes into the state willingly. There's a level of coercion sometimes, and in general with statehood. I'm not saying David and Saul were threatening people, but Saul sends a message of like, you all will show up when I call, or else. When, if there's a draft, you got to show up, or else you suffer the consequences.
Yeah, and one of these questions, like for the capital city, a question a scholar might ask is, was the city that we think is the capital, which the biblical text seems to describe as Jerusalem, was it fortified? Was it populous enough to house a royal court and administration? While the biblical text doesn't specifically mention every single detail or every single task that would have been used, there are certain things that they would have needed to have in order to to be able to keep track of all these different things, like the horses and all this whatever other stuff.
Yeah. So I think, and we'll probably come back to this concept, but I think a lot of times there's an expectation gap between what we expect, when we say like, this Jerusalem is the capital of this kingdom. We have an image in our mind of what that is. And then there's the reality of the ancient world and state formation and all these, that reality and our expectation may not match up, but it doesn't mean that the text is not right or that what happened wasn't state formation. I think in this case, a lot of times the issue is we have an expectation of what we think will be there, and then are frustrated when it's not. I think that's a through line through most of this discussion.
Yeah. And then another thing is like with military installations. So the biblical text doesn't specifically say, hey, there's a fort right here, here, and here, and we put it here because we have to protect ourselves from the Philistines over here and all this other stuff. But if they're going into battle, they're going to have strategic positions in order to protect themselves. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of it. There's the argument that this is what you're seeing in the Negev. In the 10th century, there's a bunch of new hilltop settlements, which we might be getting ahead of myself here, I don't with the video, but you see a bunch of these new settlements in the Negev, and what are they? They could just be, there could be a number of things, but they could be these sort of military installations that are there to guard trade routes through the Negev coming up from Arabia, heading towards the King's Highway and the coastal road. So again, it doesn't necessarily mean you're going to see like these huge castles, these huge fortifications. It could just be, the king is forcing what used to be a nomadic group, like, you're going to settle here, I'm going to pay you, and you're going to guard the trade route. And that's a military installation. And what does that look like? That could just be a cluster of houses, but it's functionally, it's an apparatus of the state.
Interesting.
We don't really see this in the 10th century. What we do see is a major settlement pattern crisis. Starting first in the highlands, most of the newly founded rural settlements of the early Iron Age are abandoned. Settlement patterns don't change without something major happening. The question is, what caused some settlements to be abandoned and others to grow? It seems the Philistines along the coast, who had been raiding into the highlands, created an unsettled environment where security became a top priority. The concentration of people in a smaller number of settlements facilitated the emergence of early leaders who could address that concern. As the situation in the highlands stabilized, the highland polity, or polities, began to exert influence outside the highlands. Early attempts to expand towards the Philistines, as at Kirba Kiafa, were ultimately unsuccessful. But apparently the Canaanite cities in the Shephelah aligned with the highlands, which were reinvigorated, and new settlements were founded as well, such as Lachish, Azekah, Tel Zayit, and Libnah. It also expanded its influence along the coast to sites like Tel Kasila. In the far north, two distinct processes can be seen. In the valleys, Israelite identities were less readily accepted and may have been at times imposed on settlements.
So with Beshin and Tel Rehob, you said that it's not easily, or you said something like it wasn't easily accepted or something like that. Where are you getting that data from?
So those sites have both been well excavated and they're both well published. And they're, again, what makes the site Israelite is kind of a question that scholars go around and round on.
Mm-hmm.
And there seems to be a packet of artifacts that, like when you see enough of these, you're like, okay, this is probably Israelite. And you see this packet in the highlands in the early Iron Age, and it's doesn't necessarily show up in the Jezreel and the coastal plain until later.
Yeah, and just for clarity, what is the highlands?
Highlands would be sort of like what's now like the West Bank. There's, it's kind of hard to see on this map, but there's the coastal plain where the Philistines are, Tel Kasila, where modern Tel Aviv is, and then there are the foothills, the Shephelah, that are leading up into the highlands where like Jerusalem is, where Hebron is, Shiloh, Shechem, that are like where those little tiny dots are. That's the highlands. Then you have the Jordan Valley, where the Jordan River is and the Dead Sea. So the highlands is really where like that core Israelite identity seems to really begin, or where we can see it archaeologically, I should say that. And it starts in the early Iron Age, and then in the 10th century, there's like Tel Kasila has this mixture of Philistine and more Israelite stuff. And then in the Shephelah, there's this Canaanite enclave kind of thing in the early Iron Age that adopts more Israelite customs, it seems.
So the highlands are literally a higher elevation and kind of like almost like a cliff, looks like in some ways, right?
Yeah, it's more mountainy. Yeah, it's not like mountains like you would expect. It's not like the Rockies, but it's yeah, it's just a more rugged terrain. Like there's not really good places for agriculture, so there's a lot of terracing done. So they sort of like build a terrace, and you can do agriculture on these terraces. Whereas in the lowlands, you can just you have fields where you can plant crops and that kind of stuff. So the highlands are a little bit more of a ecologically marginal area, and that's where you see the Israelites emerging, Israelite ethnogenesis, whatever you want to call it, in the early Iron Age, and then that spreads. And again, it's a question of how voluntary is this adoption of Israelite material expressions,
Hmm.
and who's doing it, who's forcing it. Is this a state sponsored? Is this David expanding, or is this is this just a cultural phenomenon where, is it demographic growth from the highlands? Like there's a lot of questions.
At times imposed on the settlements. In the hills of Galilee, their way of life and socio-political organization may have been more similar to the Israelites, and their identification more readily accepted. Something similar likely occurred in Gilead. Settlement abandonment continued in Ammon and Moab, such that early Ammonite kings and Moabite chiefdoms likely ruled over a very sparsely populated region in the 10th century. In the Negev, nearly 60 new settlements were founded in the 10th century. Sometimes called the Negev fortresses, they are more like hilltop enclosures, but are built with four-room houses and large quantities of pottery, reminiscent of that from the highlands, suggesting these sites represent efforts to control this patch of land, which was previously largely devoid of settlements, though likely populated by semi-nomadic peoples.
So basically, what you're saying is it's possible that David or somebody else, I guess maybe saw, I don't know, that could have been like, hey, you guys got to go over there to this really mountainous, terrible area to live because we got to protect these trade routes.
Yeah, there's a lot of trade moving up from Arabia. There's a trade route up through the Jordan Valley and on the coastal road, via Maris up to the Philistine area. And that's lucrative. If you're not taxing that, then you're missing out on a lot of wealth. So you have to, exert control over that area to get access, to tax it. And so you may be settling people from the highlands, which is something that again would speak to a sort of state level control. Like I'm not going to move my family down to the desert just so I can harass caravans. But if the king is saying like you're gonna go and this is what you're gonna do, then like what are you gonna do? You're gonna do what the king says. It could also be resettling nomadic peoples into these highlands or into these fortresses. And again, there's a number of perspectives on this. So there's people who will hear what I'm saying, like, no, that's not what happened. That's not what happened at all. And so you can find, this is pretty hotly debated. The settlement crisis changed in the 10th century. That was something that was relatively new to me. And I think a lot of people have missed that a lot of these sites are abandoned, and then you get site nucleation where these sites are abandoned in favor of larger sites, which I think, to me, that's a really strong indicator of state formation. Like, people don't abandon their homes lightly. So why is this happening, and what's the impulse behind it? And I think a state is as good explanation as any.
Interesting.
Similarly, around the Wadi Fainan, the intensified copper production there had some indication of Highlands influence, though likely more indirect control than direct control. This formulation presents a 10th century polity or polities that exerted influence of some kind over not only the Highlands, but into Transjordan, the Galilee, the Sharon Coast, the Shvela, and the Negev. This reconstruction of the early 10th century has far from unanimous agreement amongst archaeologists, but it matches a large portion of the available data.
All right. So you say that there's some disagreement here, but obviously, like you put all these colors as red or different shades of red because there's some kind of thing uniting them. I guess the archaeology, what you're talking about with a certain collection of, I guess, things that we find that match these other places, and that gives us reason to think that they're related. Is that all this is? Is that you've got this huge area that seems to have changes, and they all seem to match in a few different categories.
Yeah, so like Philistine material culture is obvious when you see it.
Okay.
Um, it's got a particular kinds of pottery. It's decorated a particular way. It is only in certain forms. The cooking pots, you find cooking jugs with the Philistines. Um, and cooking jugs speaks to a different way of cooking. It's not like the traditional cooking pot. So it's like it's not just that it's a different like kind of pottery, it's a different behavior with it. And so there's these like assemblages we call of artifacts that when you see enough of them, you're like, okay, yeah, this is Philistine. And the same with, you say the same with the Edomites. And there's a question of when does the Edomite state form? Um, but there's a clear enough assemblage that we associate with the Highlands that we would call, generally are called, early Israel, or associated with Israelite ethnogenesis. So you have, um, again, different people kind of differently, but there's a pork taboo. There's the four-room house. There's really no decorated pottery. There's no, there's a limited assemblage of forms. There's up in the north in particular, as we call these hippo jars, these large storage jars. There's, we don't find burials in the early Iron Age. This changes later in the Iron Age, but there seems to be simple inhumation.
Hmm.
And it's like when you find a site that has one of these things, you're not going to say that's Israelite.
Yeah.
But when you find enough of them together, you say, okay, this site, maybe it's, even though it's in the Negev, it has a very similar assemblage to a site that is in the Highlands. And when the Shetlands fail out, you go like, okay, this strata has decorated pottery. It has, Canaanite looking motifs. There's pork intermixed. There's all these things. Like, okay, well, this is not exactly Philistine. It's not exactly Israelite. It's sort of in this in between. And then the next stratum, or the stratum below it, as you're digging the next stratum, you find it looks a lot more like the sites in the Highlands than it looks like anything else. You say, okay, this assemblage matches other known assemblages, and so there's a shared culture. And it may not be fair to say that because there's a shared culture, they're the same politics. That's not necessarily accurate at all. But this, what I'm trying to show here is that like these places all have similar enough cultural of a cultural assemblage that we can group them together culturally. Now, again, can you group them together as under one political position? That's not entirely clear. And you can also, the whole point of David and Solomon is that they are, David is a conqueror. David defeats the Ammonites. You're not necessarily going to see the Ammonites adopting Israelite culture, but it doesn't mean that they weren't sort of subject to him. So you have to sort of be clear on this distinction between politics and culture.
Yeah, that's a good point. I did notice a couple of things there. So at the kind of the middle left, you have the Sharon coast, or however you pronounce that. And in this, you have one black dot. And I was a little confused like that because you have this huge red area along the coast above the Shephelah, I guess the orange area where that's where the Philistines are. But it seems like, at least if I'm reading this correctly, it seems like you're saying, hey, we found this one black dot, and therefore that entire region is this same cultural, markers.
So, yeah, there's more than one site there. And another part of it is like there's what we call Phoenician culture coming down from the north, maybe getting down to maybe Akko, which is maybe down to Dor. It's possible that you have Phoenician culture as far as Dor, which is sort of where that little nub is on the coast, that little inlet. Dor is just south of that. So Phoenician culture is sort of extending south. But there are more sites there, but also that was a pretty swampy area in the ancient world. And so you're not necessarily going to have as densely settled.
Interesting.
But I can't think of any specific.
Yeah.
That,
Not a big
I
deal.
mean, I know of sites, but I don't know
Yeah.
of the specific strata that would make my case. But yeah, to your point, that would be bad practice if there's one site, but there are a few others that would show an expansion of this cultural assemblage.
And I can't imagine it's just a coincidence, but on the one black dot we have on the Sharon coast, that is very close to the edge of where the Philistines are. So if you're talking about from like a strategic standpoint, hypothetically, if there was a united monarchy, it seems like that would be important for somebody to be around there, correct?
Yeah, there's a whole other issue of how far, what other sea peoples, the Philistines are one of the sea peoples who settle there, 1180s. And so like at Taldor, it's been argued that there are other sea peoples on the coast. And so what's happening, what is happening with all these other people groups along the coastline, how many other people groups are on the coast. But yeah, it would certainly be strategic, because there's a lot of commerce going along on the coast. The Phoenicians, or what would become the Phoenician city states, Tyre, Sidon, Beirut, there's a number of these sites up in what's now Lebanon. They manage the Bronze Age collapse better than a lot of other places, and so there's still, there's commerce beginning again. So again, having access to international markets would be a state interest.
Interesting. Okay, so yeah, let's keep going.
It is unclear, though, who was responsible for this expansion out of the highlands. It's unclear how many people or polities were responsible. The archaeology.
What is a polity?
Polity is it's a euphemism for state. Just because it's debated as to what is a state and what is sub-state, we tend to use the term polity just to avoid and sidestep this question of, is it a state or not? A state being just a certain level of socio-political complexity, and a polity, a group of tribes can be a polity, a chiefdom can be a polity. That can be something that's not, if we looked at it, be like, that's not a state, but it's some sort of political, coherent political group.
Yeah.
Doesn't have clear answers. Candidates might be sought at the important sites of the early Iron Age, like Shechem and Shiloh. But these were destroyed in the 11th century and only reoccupied later in the Iron Age.
All right, so this one really confused me. So why do you mention Shechem and Shiloh if you already know they were destroyed pretty quickly?
Shechem has a long history of being an important center in the highlands. We also see in Judges, Shechem is one of the places where somebody is setting themselves up as king at Shechem. It's one of the I can't think of the name. Abimelech. So depending on how old you think that tradition is, you might say, okay, well, maybe there's a really early Israelite tradition of a king at Shechem who is setting themselves up here. Shiloh is an important religious center. Shiloh seems to be linked with certainly Samuel, potentially Saul, depending on how you take some recent literature on the issue. So these seem to be really important early sites, and they would be the natural, again, long history of sites of Shechem being important in the highlands. And Samaria, which becomes this capital of under the Omrides, is right around the corner from Shechem. So it's that part of the highlands has a really long history of being politically important. In the late Bronze Age, Shechem is important with Labayu. When during the Amarna era, Labayu builds this really quite significant, really kind of comparable to in scale to what we see described under David and Solomon, to the point where people are even, it's been argued that Labayu is, or like some of these biblical figures are Labayu, which I don't think is accurate. But it's, he builds this really sort of similar kingdom, which is short-lived. And even in the Middle Bronze Age, Shechem is important. So those would be sort of like the natural places to look for, like if somebody if this cultural assemblage is showing up all these places, and we see that cultural assemblage in the Highlands, the sort of main centers of the Highlands are where you might look for, the origin of this. But they're both destroyed in the 11th century, so that would seem not like they're not the places.
Interesting. Okay, so they could have had some influence, I guess, hypothetically, but if it was really short time period where they're expanding. Is that a good way to put it?
Yeah, they seem to be important sites for the Israelites. Mount Gerizim is right there by Shechem. So they are important. They're significant sites. It's just they don't seem to be strong candidates for the early state.
Okay.
But these were destroyed in the 11th century and only reoccupied later in the Iron Age. The Bible says this was ruled from Jerusalem, which was at the time a small city in the Highlands and not an obvious candidate for the center of such a large polity. This is one location where the text and archaeology seem in tension.
All right, so you just briefly talk about how Jerusalem is not a huge center, and a big problem people have with this conversation is that Jerusalem has had continuous habitation. In other words, people have always lived there, which means much of any possible evidence for any kind of Solomon, David, or whatever is built over, it's eroded, destroyed, and then oftentimes when something is destroyed, that's actually how we find the evidence of it. But if it's being continually lived on, then you're not going to have as much. So, in other words, you say that Jerusalem is small, but you also admit that we're missing a lot of the evidence that we would find if any are there. So, can you talk about that kind of perceived conflict?
Yeah, so that's a very fair issue. If Jerusalem is basically left alone, if it's not destroyed to seal it, you don't get that good, nice destruction layer. It can be hard to find occupation. If David's building a palace and then Solomon lives in it and then Rehoboam and on down the line, you're not going to see the palace destroyed. You're just going to see floors being repaved. You're going to see refurbishing it. You're going to see they add on a wall here. They're going to divide this room. They're going to add a room over there. So you're going to see gradual phasing, which again can be difficult to date. But just because a site has been occupied continuously occupied, you still find evidence of occupation. So we know of the Middle Bronze Age Jerusalem. There's in the Middle Bronze Age they built a little, and not little, but a towers around the spring, the Gihon Spring. So we find earlier things, earlier eras at Jerusalem. But also, I don't know if I get into this or not, I don't remember, but we don't find a lot of 14th century at Jerusalem either. In the 14th century, Jerusalem is archaeologically mostly invisible. But in the 14th century, we have the Amarna letters found in Egypt. It's this cache of diplomatic letters sent from the Canaanite kings to Pharaoh. And we know that Jerusalem existed. We know that there was a king in Jerusalem. We know that Jerusalem was an important center. And so we know nobody would debate that 14th century Jerusalem was occupied and that there was a king there and that he was a vassal of Egypt. That's not debated. We can debate how large of a polity it was. How big of an area did Jerusalem control? That's not super clear, but nobody would debate that it existed in the 14th century. So the other issue is, in the 10th century, we may not have a lot to go on archaeologically, but that doesn't mean that it wasn't there, or wasn't occupied, and it wasn't a significant important city. But again, here's where I think another example of that expectation gap. We tend to want capital cities to be the big city. When you think of another country's capital, it's like, oh, the biggest city is this, so that's the capital. But that's not necessarily how it worked. I mean, the capital is where the king was. And so there's some good articles that argue that Jerusalem is the capital because that's where the Davidic house is, and that Jerusalem may be just sort of like a glorified royal estate. And, it doesn't necessarily have to be a huge city, especially in the 10th century. That it's important because that's where the king is, and they build the temple there because the king has to have a good relationship with God, for the good of the whole state. So this is like that expectation of, we want Jerusalem to be big, we want it to be significant because that's what capitals are. And that I think that's a modern imposition on the past, and that we can have Jerusalem be basically just where David's household is. That's where David's probably where his mighty men live. That's probably where the people who help run the court live, and maybe that's it. So again, what should we actually expect from a 10th century capital? It's not entirely clear. There's some really good research on the patrimonial model of the state, which seems to fit for the 10th century for Judah and Israel. But the state can be envisioned as a household. A lot of the officials in both Saul and David's court are family members. We see this at Ugarit. We see this in a number of places where the state is envisioned as a household. So the capital could just be a royal estate. It doesn't have to be a bureaucratic, you don't have to have all these office buildings for the tax collector and the census keeper, and you don't have to have all of that. It could just be relatively minor, relatively
like a
small.
vacation home.
Yeah, I mean, like, can the president run the government from Camp David? Does it have to be in Washington, D.C.? Which is not a perfect example, but you can run the state from wherever the person in charge of the state is.
Okay. So I kind of want to get into specifics here. So there's been a number of finds at Jerusalem. At the same time, it's still very difficult to find anything because, well, some would argue because the evidence doesn't exist. Other people would argue it's just because it's all been covered up, essentially. So there's been pottery shards from that time period. There's been possible elite buildings like the large stone structure, so-called, which maybe is possibly a palace foundation. There is parts of a city wall that dates to the time period. Possibly there's a 6-chambered gate that is similar to Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer, although it's not exactly the same. So maybe we'll hear about your thoughts about that later. But scholars have noted that this is not like some large populous city. And some have argued maybe it's more just like a fortified village or a town. You're talking like 10 to 12 acres, 1,000 to 5,000 population at the very maximum in the 10th century. And just so people can understand as far as from a map perspective. So, and we know you're not an expert. Maybe you're not 100% up to date with all the scholarship here, but what of this are we looking at that is possibly 10th century that we can confidently say?
Yeah, so that the map you have here is would be a second temple period. That temple up there, that's Herod's temple. The large temple mount, that's all built by Herod. In the 10th century, you would have a more natural hill going up to that. And that's probably, if that is where the first temple would have been located. Going towards the south, there is where it says the city of David. That's where the 10th century city would have been located. There's, and it's hard to tell with the modern topography because it's been built up and all kinds of stuff, but there's a natural sort of uh, hill, like it's this very steep projection from really from Mount Zion. And that's what the city of David is built on in the 10th century. And again, it expands. The city of Jerusalem expands to the western hill, what here is labeled the upper city, across the Tyropian Valley. That expands in the 8th century. Again, it's not super clear why it expands. It could be refugees coming from Samaria after the Assyrians destroy it. It could be a number of other things.
But that's after David and Solomon.
That's
So
after David
upper
and
city
Solomon.
section. Are we saying that it was just, we know confidently it was not there at all?
There's really no evidence for 10th century occupation there. Not like the city of David is where the 10th century city would be located. And that, like, as you mentioned, there's the maybe the Jebusite city, the pre-Davidic city. There's the stepstone structure, which is probably, it looks like a retaining wall of some sort.
What's a retaining wall?
It's just a wall to hold back earth, to hold back the actual natural like mountainside to support it. But it also is supporting, you could then build something significant on top of it. But that the stepstone structure pretty securely dated to the 11th century prior to David, but could have been used by David as a, to build on top of. You can build a palace on top of that. And there's been monumental architecture found in the city of David that dates to the Iron Age. I am not up on what they found, so I don't want to speak too far outside of what I know. But again, there's clearly monumental stuff there, but it does and it could date to 10th century. I don't know. I don't know for sure.
Yeah. Well, what I found from looking into it is that anytime you have any kind of claim at all, you almost always have some super conservative person, most likely trying to justify their claims. And then you have a very non-conservative person that is saying, like, just completely is like, no, that's not true at all. And it's hard to find if there's a middle ground or not, or maybe maybe it's legit. It's just hard to tell. And then there's apparently, like, they find pottery in the middle of the structure, but that's not a confident way to date something.
And for the 10th century, your best dating tool is going to be the pottery. So that's iron 2A pottery. And this was part of a larger debate around chronology. And I think there's a probably pretty good case for what we call a long iron 2A, and you can have iron 2A early pottery, iron 2A late pottery. And so to really parse out, if somebody says this is 10th century, you would have to look at the pottery and know what you're looking at. You'd have to know, okay, yeah, this is or this is not 10th, iron 2A. Is this iron 2A early? Is it iron 2A late? But again, knowing what's early and late is going to be comparing it to other sites with 10th century strata, and saying, okay, well, at Khirout Khirout, this is what the pottery looks like. And then if we go to, other sites, other 10th century sites, say, okay, this is what early 10th century pottery looks like, iron 2A, early iron 2A. And then you'd have to look at it, and then you can look at the pottery they found in Jerusalem and say, okay, yeah, this is the same stuff. Or like maybe it's a little bit different, which could just be a regional variation. It could be a Jerusalem variation. It could be a chronological variation. And so it's harder to tell. And then you look at the pottery they found, and you have to look at where it was found. Is it found under a floor? Is it found sitting on top of a floor? Is it found, when they build stone walls, they'll put pottery in to, as part of they call it chinking. You put chinking in to help support the wall. So where was it found? That's a whole. So it's just, this is the nitty gritty of archaeology. Of just because you find pottery there doesn't mean that's when it dates. I've worked at a late antique site, mid 300s, and we pull out a piece of pottery from the late Bronze Age. That's, from 1400 BC. Like, pottery moves, but it's one piece. So it doesn't mean, it's just one piece. So you have to, it's not just like they found a piece of 10th century pottery. You have to look at the entire assemblage. You have to look at how that compares to other assemblages found at other sites. You can use carbon dating, and our carbon dating is getting a lot better, especially around this time period. But even with every carbon, one carbon date doesn't mean anything. You need several carbon dating, like several samples, and then it kind of depends on what the sample is. The gold standard, it would be like an olive pit, because that's one season, right? You have the olives grow in one season, and it's going to date to that year. That's great. So, but if it's typically we wouldn't rely too much on a date from like a wooden beam, right? Because who knows when the wood was chopped down? Who knows how long it was used, how long it was reused? So it's a lot more complicated than they found the pottery there. Usually, you can trust. That's what the archaeologist's job is. There's like, this dates the pottery is 10th century. We found it, in a context that would say it's 10th century. And Eilat Mazar has been excavating at Jerusalem, and she's good. She's talented. She knows what she's doing. So you can usually, you don't always trust the excavator. Or maybe trust but verify. But the idea is that they're supposed to be experts, and they tell you what they found, and go from it. But to check it, you have to really know. You've got to. It's not just looking at the publication. You've got to look at. You got to know what you're looking at. You got to know your pottery.
Yeah. So something I'm struggling with that fully understanding is, you have some things from Jerusalem that have been found, and there looks like some kind of building. It's not 100% sure that it's this time period, maybe, or maybe it is sure, and we found more evidence since the certain books. I mean, like every single year we're finding more evidence for these things, or things that disprove our other previous claims. But in other words, it seems like there's something there, but from what I've read, at least, it's not a lot. As I said before, 10 to 12 acres, 1 to 5,000 maximum population in 10th century. But if you compare that with what the biblical texts, they seem to describe as Solomon's super wealthy, like silver is considered nothing. And maybe that's hyperbole, almost certainly it's hyperbole, but 666 talents of gold annually, massive palace provisions, trade empires, horse, chariots, exotics, in First Kings, building grand projects, including the temple. He builds his own palace, which takes 13 years to build. That's got to be a pretty big palace if it's taking 13 years, which apparently it's more elaborate than other descriptions. As I said before, horse cities, store chariots. Then you have the mention of Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer, which are pretty nice places. We can confidently say that is nice. We don't know if that's specifically Solomon, as we'll talk about in a second. All that to say, yes, so we have some impressive things, and there's a little bit of monumental stuff in Jerusalem. At the same time, it seems really odd that if Solomon is like the richest person ever to live, that he's got this very, very small capital. What do you think about that?
Yeah, that's attention, and I don't know how big of an issue it is for me, just because, one, I think hyperbole is definitely a part of We see it in the Bible. We see it in Near Eastern literature. So how much hyperbole is at work here is I think, an honest question we can ask. I don't think it's doubting the text in any way. To ask, like, is there a figure of speech at play here that we are being overly literal on? Maybe we are, maybe we aren't. I think, a lot of the trade stuff, like, that's totally, you can operate that from a small capital, from a small royal estate. And yeah, it's part of the issue is if this is if Jerusalem is not destroyed, if Jerusalem is not, burned down to seal stuff for us, we're just going to see a lot of continued occupation. And so it's difficult to tell what would be Solomonic and what would be later. But even again, just about the scale, part of, who's building it for, and is he using corvée labor? Well, that seems to be what is implied, that he's pulling people from across the kingdom to come work. So the work might be seasonal. You're not necessarily thinking that, like, this is decades of, 13 years, whatever, straight nonstop work, but seasonal labor from conscripts. So I think there are mitigating factors. I don't know if this is answering your question at all. But yeah, I think to your point, there is a tension here. Like, there seems to be, this seems to be like the greatest place ever. And then we're not finding that.
Yeah. Yeah. And then there's also something interesting where you have places like Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer that they are, I can't remember where they are on the map. Are they all three up north? Is that correct?
Gezer is closer to Jerusalem. Megiddo is in the Jezreel Valley up north, and then Hatzor is north of the Sea of Galilee.
Okay, so it's not like you have three places that are really far away, and then you got Jerusalem, but Jerusalem just happens to be the capital, right?
Yeah, well, and those are all on trade routes. So they're all on really significant communication routes. The Via Maris goes, runs along the coast, and Gezer has a really great view of that entire area. And Megiddo is in a really strategic location in the Jezreel Valley. So a lot of communication and trade is going to move through Megiddo. Hatzor has a long tradition of being an important hub for commerce. So these are not, they were already important sites. And so they come to Solomon, and he, utilizes them, fortifies them. With the, Yigal Yadin famously made that connection between the so-called 6-chamber gates. There have been more 6-chamber gates found since then. So, like, there's a 10th century 6-chamber gate. I call them Piran chambers, I think, is the new terminology. But Ashdod has a so-called 6-chamber gate that's contemporary, and nobody would argue that that's Solomonic. So I think there's some hesitation. It used to be that you find a 6-chamber gate, like, oh, this is almost like an ethnic or political marker of Solomon. And I think that's not, we don't take that anymore. But like the gate at Gezer, that pretty clear that's 10th century. They're finishing up publication on the recent excavations there. That's in progress. So we'll have all of that data out here pretty soon. They've done some publications on dating that. So I mean, Israel Finkelstein's Low Chronology was wanting to push all of this to the 9th century, which is the larger chronological issue. And that debate has largely settled down to what we now call the modified traditional chronology,
Hmm.
where the traditional chronology got lowered by a few decades. The low chronology has been moved up, and this is part of like the long Iron 2A. You just have this period of prosperity between David, Solomon, down to the Elmerites, and so it's hard to differentiate. Yeah, but so with those gates, you see like the piers and then chambers in between. And there's some kind of more recent research on these gates. Daniel Fries has a book on and gates. And this again, the larger there's a good research on what gate means in the Bible. And we tend to think of it as like that structure of, there would have been a door, or maybe one door, maybe 3 or 4 doors. And we think of that as the gate. So like when they say like so and so was in the gate. But really more and more we tend to think that the gate is all of the sort of public area at the entrance of the city. So like the elders sitting in the gateway doesn't mean they're sitting in those chambers. There's a bunch of public buildings around these structures. So like especially you can see this at Megiddo. You see it at Beersheba. Beersheba is a good example, where there's the gate, the entrance to the city, and then a bunch of public architecture that would all probably have been considered the gateway. Sorry, that's a tangent. But yeah, I mean, I think dating these to the period of Solomon is not as problematic as it was a few years ago. And again, the carbon dating is getting better. There's the Gezer publication will come out. I know for a fact they are working on that. And that will be out. I don't know when it will be out, but that will give some much needed clarity on the dating of that. Cause the recent excavations at Gezer, they went through, they got 10th century, 9th and 8th century strata all stacked on top of each other. So they're going to get really good, really granular like pieces. So that's going to be very helpful for understanding this.
Fascinating. Okay. So you've kind of like beat around the bush here about a lot of these things, and specifically, so you talk about how this big red area on the screen here, that hey, maybe it's Jerusalem's the capital, maybe these other places are the capital, maybe it's run by David or Solomon, and some people would say, oh well, we've got all this evidence for it, and we'll talk about some of that. That this was the gosh, what is the word? United Monarchy, but we don't have any other texts that say it was run by anybody else. So some people might think like, okay, you're just like making up somebody else. I don't know, to just, obviously you're a Christian, so this is not something you're doing, but you're just making something else up when the evidence clearly says it's David and Solomon. That's the only examples we have. So if you get what I'm saying, why would you propose anybody else if we don't even have a text of it? We don't know anybody exists.
Yeah, there's kind of a trend within scholarship that's sort of looking at that the early Iron Age period and saying there was a lot going on, and what the Bible is presenting is sort of like all history is telling us what mattered, right? It's not telling us every single thing that happened, and so especially for this Iron 1 period prior to David, there's a lot going on there, and we're not necessarily told all of it. And so this like there are 12 tribes and they all identify as Israel. Like this is something that I think certainly comes to be true. But even in Judges, like the Gibeonites sort of become Israelite during that's in Joshua. They become Israelite. They get a treaty with Joshua. So I think there's a lot of really messy stuff going on. There's identities are in flux. People are becoming Israelite. I think there's a core Israelite that's called an Exodus group, but it's not so linear as the Bible presents it. I think the Bible looking back on it, you see this linear trajectory, but I think archaeologically we're not seeing just the linear path. We're seeing a bunch of other things. So when it comes to state formation, scholars will talk about like the Benjamin Plateau polity. And this seems to predate a Davidic kingdom, and that there's a cluster of sites that, again, if we didn't have the Bible, we would look like, well, this kind of looks like an early state. And this would be north of Jerusalem. And so if we didn't have the Bible, we would look at the archaeology and be like, well, there seems to be a number of things going on here. And so, but because we have the Bible, we want to say this was the Benjamin polity, that's Saul. And we want to look at, all this expansion of this cultural assemblage, like that's David. And like, I do think there's a really strong case to maybe that this is David. I think there's a lot of cases from the ancient world of these really charismatic figures who just through their own competence and their own like who they are, they are able to build large territorial kingdoms that don't really survive them very much. So for example, like Labayu talked about that, from the 14th century. It's this really sort of charismatic figure who seems to rise from, he doesn't necessarily seem to be have royal heritage, but he becomes king of Shechem. We don't know that he's not a prince, but he becomes king of Shechem, builds this large coalition, and he controls a huge part of the highlands. We see this in Amuru in the 14th century. There's this guy named Abdi Ashirta, and he builds this pretty sizable kingdom. Idrimi of Arlok in the 15th century is one. People have likened Idrimi's story to David's. Like they say, some people have argued that like, well, the Idrimi story must have been so popular, and that the David story is just a retelling of the Idrimi story, where Idrimi is sort of forced out of his home from the king of Mitanni. He's forced out of his home, and he goes amongst the Apiru, and he has people flocking to him, and then he gets signs from the gods to go attack, and he goes and he takes the city of Alak and becomes king of Alak. And people say, well, this, David is forced out of the palace by King Saul, and he goes and he gets wild men who gather around him at the cave of Adullam, and then he eventually becomes king in Jerusalem. So you have this sort of same sequence, the same narrative sequence. And even further back, Shamshi Adad is in Mesopotamia. He builds this really huge kingdom, and then his sons are kind of idiots and they can't sustain it, and the whole thing falls apart. So if you see in David that this charismatic, competent military figure who rises and builds a kingdom, and there's a number of people who have a sort of shared identity, and they follow him, and he builds this kingdom. It's sustained by Solomon, and then after Solomon, it breaks apart. Like that's just, that is not controversial in just as we understand ancient Near Eastern history. Like that's not a crazy story at all. There are cases of that almost exact story of somebody building a short-lived but sizable kingdom and then it falling apart a few generations later. That's not controversial. Because it's in the Bible, it becomes controversial. But like that, the bones of that story are, that's, I don't think that's a crazy story at all when it comes to Near Eastern history.
I did, on that same thought, when you talk about the huge difference in land that we talked about earlier. So, That's not even the
Makes
biggest.
foolish decision.
Yep. So that you have this huge amount of land, at least, and maybe there's some hyperbole there. There is some hyperbole. Like, we know that there were some parts of this map here that were definitely not Israelite. Is that correct? Because it seems like the biblical text is saying, hey, Solomon had this place, but either some people would say, hey, well, they didn't know that. They were just saying this is just really, they just assumed that, maybe without verifying it, or they didn't have a way to verify it, or it was some type of way of hyperbole saying that we have all of this to all of this. It is just this huge area. So whatever that is, so that's obviously a huge difference than if it'll play than this. So like that's a huge difference. So what you're saying is maybe we don't have it on that grand scale of difference, but we do have lots of instances of a very strong group of people living, and then just within a few different generations, it's all gone.
Yeah. Yeah, that you can have these sort of charismatic figures build large kingdoms that don't last at that size and that scale. Past, once the charisma is gone, there's, there wasn't much holding it back together. And the Bible will look back on this and be like, well, they're all Israelite. It's bad that they're not all united. I'm not saying that that's obviously that's what the Bible is telling us, so that is true. But that may not be how everybody back then perceived it. If that makes, like, if you're living in Galilee, you don't necessarily like Rehoboam. So what has Rehoboam done for me? I don't want to be subject to Rehoboam. Like, supposedly we are of the same people, and later they say, yeah, well, it shouldn't matter. You should all be under the Davidic line. So again, I just think archaeology has one picture and the Bible is giving us another picture. And I think there's tension is to be expected, and the Bible is telling us what matters and it's telling us what's important. And archaeology is getting there's a lot of noise. The Bible is canceling out the noise and telling us, like, here's the story that matters. This is what you need to know. And archaeology is getting a whole bunch of other stuff, which as an archaeologist, I think is great. I love all the other stuff. But trying to find that same signal in all of the noise, that same biblical signal in our archaeological noise, can be tricky. It's just, and again, there's that expectation gap of, like, when the Bible is describing something, like, I expect it to look a particular way, and then you look and it's like, okay, it's there. It's just not what I was expecting to find. It's not how I thought it would look. And that's that's a deficiency in my understanding, my expectations. That's kind of how I look at all of this, and not just with United Monarchy, but there's a lot of stuff with the Bible and archaeology where it's like, okay, well, I was expecting something and it's looking different.
In terms of settlement patterns and shared. There's evidence for a sizable polity in terms of settlement patterns and shared culture, but the apparatus of a state is seemingly missing. There are solutions to this conundrum, though.
All right, so settlement nucleation, what is that?
That's so instead of having a bunch of small, little, tiny rural settlements, they are seemingly forcibly nucleated into fewer, larger settlements.
Okay. And ceramic distribution?
That's the sort of consistent. We see, like, similar ceramic assemblages in that sort of, like, red area, that we see a very similar ceramic. Like, they're all using the same stuff. They're eating the same food. They're transporting stuff the same way. They're storing stuff the same way. There's similar patterns of behavior that are using the ceramics.
Mhm. Yeah, so I read online, and you can confirm this is wrong or right. There's a distinctive pottery type, storage jar called the Hippo jar in northern Israel during this time. It's produced in a limited workshop but distributed widely and uniformly across the region. It can suggest centralized production and distribution under administrative oversight. So I don't know if that's made up or not, but maybe that's an example of
Yeah.
how this could work.
Yeah, exactly. That there's, and again, like standard forms would sort of suggest standard weights and measures. There's a lot of value in making sure everybody is using um, the same formats, the same size of stuff. Like if you are wanting, say, I want this weight of goods submitted in taxes every year, you got to make sure everybody's using the same weights and measures. Um, and so it's sort of standard ceramic sizes are going to sort of attest. We see this in the 8th century with Hezekiah and the Kolomelech jars. They have a kind of similar standardized size, um, which again serves state functions. If everybody's using the same weights and measures, that's a state issue.
Interesting. Yeah. And commercial networks, just real quick.
Yeah, just evidence that the state is trying, or somebody is trying to exert influence over trade networks, usually for the purpose of taxing them.
Okay. And
There's no reason to there's no reason for I don't want to control trade over there. Because what am I going to do with it? But if somebody is trying to control a trade network, that usually means they're going to try to tax it and make money off of it.
yeah, or and shared cultural assemblages you kind of talked about, but what is that?
Yeah, that's just that sort of packet of artifacts, the forum houses, the pork taboo, all that shared culture.
Yeah. Yeah. And then on the left, you say that there's a lack of evidence for a state with no widespread record keeping, military infrastructure, evidence of an urban capital city. So we have a capital city, possibly, but it's not like an urban capital. So
Yeah,
was that
it's
means like
not.
people were living there? We got a bunch of trade happening.
Yeah, so again, this expectation gap of we expect the capital to be this bureaucratic large center, um, where everybody's coming to, and Jerusalem is off the beaten path. People are not going to Jerusalem for lots of reasons,
Hmm.
at least in the 10th century. The trade is kind of going to the Jordan Valley. It's going along the coast. People are not traipsing through the highlands to get to Jerusalem for commerce.
Hmm.
So you have this relatively small city when you expect a large urban capital. But again, I think this maybe is not as strong a point as often is. It's not, well, Jerusalem's tiny. It doesn't exist in the 10th century. Therefore, you can't have this. It can't be the center of a large state. It's I don't know that that's necessarily the best argument when you have patrimonial models of statehood that don't require that and wouldn't expect that.
Yeah.
And with
And
military infrastructure, you don't see large forts. We Khirbet Kiafa is maybe the only thing that might be military infrastructure, but it's again, that seems to be more of a forced settlement closer to control the border more than it is distinctly military site. And we see later in the Iron II, later kings are building military infrastructure. So Tel Arad, that's a fortress. So later kings are building forts.
So just so I understand correctly, so hypothetically, it is possible there could be a United Kingdom without a military infrastructure, but wouldn't you say that's very unlikely if you do have all these texts talking about David or mainly David or Saul just going around killing a bunch of people?
Yeah, I think there's no there. I don't think we have an expectation that they're going to have a standing army. The warfare is going to be seasonal, because the warriors are all farmers, and so it's going to be that's the famous line with David and Bathsheba, when the time for war, David's going to have a core of professional soldiers, like those his mighty men, his 30. You know, he's going to have a bodyguard. He's going to have people who are sustained by the court. You know, collecting taxes and the royal estate. Like they're going to sustain his core of elite soldiers, but the army is going to be just people who answer the call when the king says assemble at this, you know, at this place. We're gonna, you know, sort of like David's brothers are going down to fight Goliath, and David is bringing them food. It's not really this particularly organized. There's no real logistics line. There's no, like, it's just, hey, everybody show up here and we're all going to come and we're going to fight the Philistines. And people are bringing them food along the way and all that kind of stuff. So you can still have an army and you can still have, you know, campaigns without that hardcore military infrastructure. It's possible for sure.
So Finkelstein and other scholars have argued that David was some kind of like warlord. So how does that compare with your model?
I think it's more of a semantic issue. I think if you want to call him a warlord, that's fine. I mean, a number of the, you know, Abdi Shirta from the 14th century, he's pretty clearly a warlord. Shamsi Adad looks a lot like a warlord. Yeah, what's the difference between like a warlord and a legitimate king? I mean,
yeah. So I guess I guess and maybe the way they portray it as people that take this view, it seems to me that they're saying the difference is that you've got all these, I guess, riches or all these things you own, all these monuments and stuff like that, compared to a tribal guy who's just in charge of everybody, but doesn't have, I guess, the city isn't worried about building all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, but I mean, the others, yeah, I think that sort of like transition from like a tribal warlord into a king of a state, like David is that transition, like Saul is that transition, David is that transition, and later down the line you have like the heritage of statehood, that there's an expectation that the line of David is the king. You don't have that, you know, the North has a more tribal, almost like elective monarchy, where the tribes have a more say in who becomes king. But in Judah, it's this, like the line of David is the king, but like that doesn't happen overnight. This, like, statehood is a process, and you're not gonna, like, I don't know why you would expect the first king to have all of this infrastructure built overnight. Like that's not really a reasonable expectation. I think I talk about, you know, like the White House and the Capitol building weren't built in the United States until decades after we were a country. Like the infrastructure that goes with statehood takes time. And so with David and Solomon, I don't know that we would expect the same investment in infrastructure that we see later kings able to put in. You're still going to see investment in infrastructure, but it may not be as intensive or as coordinated, or as it may not have the same look. Like it's going to be this sort of like messy process of becoming a state. So, you know, it's, again, what we expect and what's there don't always match, but doesn't mean that what's there doesn't match what we're told is happening.
That is really interesting. So if you have, say, hypothetically, a bunch of tribes, and then Saul comes along, it's not like his first thought's gonna be like, I'm gonna build a bunch of stuff. And
He's got to control the people.
Yeah. And then you also have David in the same group. David born around the same time, very closely, at least according to the biblical narrative.
Yeah.
And then Solomon, although he is really rich, but he does seem to build a lot of things in the text. I don't know, maybe that's things ascribed to him later that maybe he didn't even do. Who knows? Depends on your view of inspiration, and the evidence and all the arguments and all that stuff. But but it's not like it wouldn't be crazy to say that, you know, a generation or two after we're just living as a bunch of tribes that we're like, okay, well, we got to start building buildings and we
Yeah.
got to make this city nice.
Yeah, like you develop a tradition of monumental architecture. You gotta like that stuff. It takes time. Like if you're forming a state, you got bigger fish to fry than building storehouses. Like you've got to build up, you know, like you gotta make sure everybody knows who they're paying taxes to, so that you can have taxes, and then you can find a place to store it all. You know, like you get
Yeah.
stuff happens in a sequence,
Yeah.
and
Yeah. So that's but I do want to clarify that that's just kind of talking about what is possible. We still have to look at the evidence, have to
yeah.
compare that with the biblical text, ask whether the biblical text is describing something historical. Um, is is this some type of later editing? Is this hyperbole? Is this the whole text is it non-historical? Those kind of questions.
Yeah,
Uh,
there's
mhm.
yeah, those are um this is where I think archaeologists and biblical scholars tend to talk past one another.
Hmm.
Um where like I want to talk this stratum and that stratum, and a biblical scholar might be like, "Oh, well, this all dates to, Jeroboam the second." Like Jeroboam the second is Solomon's kingdom is really Jeroboam the second's kingdom. Like that's obvious. And it's like, okay, well, you're not we're just talking past each other. And I think, you know, different biblical scholars will date the text to different periods, and they will see like, oh, it says Solomon, but it's really describing this. Or it's like they say David, but they're really describing, you know. So it's, and everybody's got different thoughts about when stuff was written, which, it's not, I have opinions, but I'm not by any means an expert, so I don't want to.
Yeah.
Conundrum, though. It is possible that the patrimonial states of the Near East do not need many of the expected material hallmarks of the state, being held together primarily through kinship and personal networks as opposed to bureaucratic institutions. Additionally, early states need not spawn with a fully developed apparatus of state.
Yeah.
Independence Hall in Philadelphia was
So you kind of get into what you're talking about there, but
Mhm.
that specific,
existing a fully
could you
developed
specifically
bureaucratic
say here? Did you want to add anything to that of what you had said previously, or blend those together?
No, I mean, there's again different models of statehood are gonna argue for different material signatures. Um, and the patrimonial model is sort of the in vogue model now. And I think there's a lot to be said for it, that this, the state is thought of as an extended house. And so everything's gonna be handled interpersonally. It's gonna be handled by people who the king trusts, usually the king's relatives. And that's not necessarily gonna leave a big material footprint. So
Hmm.
I think that shifts over time. There's, again, bureaucracy is another one of those things that like develops. It doesn't, it's not spawned in. They say, okay, David's king, now we're a state, so these are all the things that we need. I think bureaucracy proves to be valuable over time, and so it starts showing up, and you start to see evidence of it. And then they start tracking who's paying taxes, what are the districts where they are, where are the people living, and I think this is behind, like the districts of Solomon. Like I think you're starting to say, okay, well, this is probably where they're saying, okay, there's benefit in tracking all of this. We're going to start tracking where everybody is and how much they can contribute. And so I think you can see that development in the text.
Yeah, that is interesting because everybody would agree that that happened at some point. There
Mhm.
was a transition phase. So a lot of times the debate is, did Solomon do it? But it certainly did happen. So that's an interesting distinction there. But um, Yeah, Lex said historiography is a provisional, probabilistic, and granular endeavor. We're not certain is an unsatisfying answer, but often the most rigorous and honest one. Yeah, so definitely true. Just you have 30 seconds to answer. What happens beneath the Bible?
I got videos that are waiting to be edited.
Oh,
We're not
okay.
done. I'm not done. There's just a couple other irons in the fire. But yeah,
Oh,
we're not
cool.
done. We're hoping to rise from the ashes of here before too long. We're not done.
So like and subscribe to Beneath the Bible.
Yeah.
So let's see here. All right, that's fun. Okay, so so you've kind of made a case of some kind of case for that. There seems to be a lot of, maybe not necessarily looking exactly like that, but uh, maybe more like that, or whatever, of maybe some unified group in some way, and maybe this was David, and maybe it was at Jerusalem. You've given us a possibility of how this would work, and yes, the archaeology, we found texts that mentioned David really, really close to the time period, so seems highly likely that he exists. We'll talk about that in a second, maybe. um, that doesn't necessarily prove everything that is mentioned in the Bible. So obviously that doesn't just it doesn't, that what we're looking at there doesn't suddenly prove that David fought a Goliath, or that all the stuff that's happened in the biblical text is 100% true historical 21st century narrative or something like that. At the same time, that is really interesting that it's not absolutely crazy to think that a David could have controlled a large period of, or a large area of space. At the same time, then there's the question of what is the Bible claiming? So we've kind of talked about it. That seems like Solomon, the text portrays it as having him having a lot of money, a lot of buildings, or some buildings that he was trying to build. David having a lot of area. Is there anything else that we haven't mentioned that you think is important that people should know about when we're talking about this topic of that's important, that when we're comparing the archaeology and what the biblical text is saying?
I mean, I think you did a good summary there. I think I think it's fully reasonable to see a sort of kingdom of David and Solomon. I think the archaeology would support that. I think other archaeologists can say, look at it and say, no, I don't think that. I think it's just a matter of, probability. We're looking at like, this could be that, it could not be that. If we didn't have the Bible, I don't know that we would look at this and be like, oh, this is somebody named David. Even with the Tel Dan still, I don't know that we would look at it and be like, oh, that must be David.
Right.
But I think because we have the Bible, I don't think it's unreasonable to look and be like, yeah, who else would it be? Like, doesn't make sense. But again, that maximalist, from the river of Egypt to the Euphrates, like I think we have to keep in mind that there's, modern 21st century historiographical traditions are great for us. And when we see like, oh, this is history writing, we have this assumption that that's what history has always been. And that history can be written differently, that our journalistic as it was kind of history, that's how we understand it. And while they were still telling us history, they're telling, the biblical writers are telling us what's important and giving us all the nitty gritty of territorial boundaries and exact dates of when this happened. And like, they're just concerned with different things, and that's okay. And we just need to keep in mind that genre difference, and that what we expect it to be telling us may not be what it's trying to tell us. This happens all the time where, I'll come to a text and I'll be looking at it more archaeologically, and instead of being like, okay, what's actually important here? Like, like this is just personally I look at like, oh, God's trying to tell me something, and it's not archaeological. And so I think, but this also happens the reverse way, where we look at something, we want there to be something historical or archaeological, and it's like, well, they're trying to tell you something different here, and that's okay, you know.
Yeah. Yeah. So there's one thing I want to mention. So, and as regards to military conquest, empire building, David is shown as a mighty warrior who expands Israel's borders, defeats Philistines, Moabites, Ammonites, Edomites, Amalekites, and receives tribute from them. Uh, the text says his kingdom extends from the river Euphrates to the land of the Philistines and to the border of Egypt. So that would be that really, really big area on the screen there that maybe not so much. And it says that Jerusalem is the capital. David captures the Jebusite stronghold of Jerusalem, makes it his royal city, brings the Ark of the Covenant there. Lots of wealth and prosperity. Then you can talk a lot about that. Solomon rules over all the kingdoms from the Euphrates River to the land of the Philistines, as far as the border of Egypt. Surrounding nations bring tribute and serve him all his life. He has peace on every side. His own palace complex, 13 years to build. Then, as I mentioned before, Hatzor, Megiddo, Gezer, more. I do find that really interesting that some of the biggest places that we have found is mentioned as things that Solomon did fortify, at least in the text. So I guess hypothetically, if someone's living in the 300 BCE or something like that, or 500, 700 BCE, they might see, okay, these are our three biggest buildings. Must have been Solomon. So I guess hypothetically, maybe you could say that that's what happened. I'm sure there's more.
To me, the easier pill to swallow is that there was, there's rudimentary records that were kept, like, and we know from other civilizations that they would copy writing by copying what's in the palace. And sometimes what's in the palace is like records of who went and worked where, or like this is like Solomon requisitioned labor to go build Gezer, Hatzor, and Megiddo. And so when you're a scribe and you're training, like, you're going to copy that. And so stuff gets worked into and preserved. So to me, the easier pill to swallow is that there's some tradition that gets kept and preserved, and that's why it shows up, instead of somebody later either like making it up or inferring this, or because like there's 10th century stuff there. So how did they know if they're not using some sort of source? Like the text may be written way later, but it seems obvious to me that they're using sources from an earlier period, but they're working it all together. And I don't know. That's my 2 cents. I'm not a biblical scholar.
Yeah. So like when we look at Greek myths and even some of the craziest stories that with Homer and all the other stuff, the Odyssey and all that. So there are historical aspects of it, and people that existed that maybe were mentioned, or places that mentioned and very similar things, but not exactly the same thing. So in that hypothetical scenario, you have maybe someone like Solomon, maybe not explicitly named Solomon, or maybe it is named Solomon and he did live there, but that doesn't necessarily mean that every single thing in the text exactly as described, or certain narratives, like for example, there's debate about the whole narrative of when the two women come with the two children, and he's like, let's cut them in half. And so there's an argument to be made that's not historical specifically, but maybe these other things are historical, or we have sources for this and maybe not sources for this when the texts are being written, and maybe we're drawing from both, but or we're drawing from oral tradition that might not be true as far as historically speaking, but they're including things that they're not really concerned about the truth to begin. I mean, the historical truth to begin with, because there's other reasons to include the text in there. So, it's a very, very
historicity is not necessarily their primary. They can include stories of dubious historicity to convey something that's something that's true that needs to be told. Like that's that is within the realm of possibility.
Yeah. So as we're talking about the whole Solomonic gates and stuff like that, as you see on the screen, I have a question for you. If Solomon was the wisest man ever, why did he need 700 wives? Was he conducting a long-term peer review study?
Oh, there's a lot of stuff he did that doesn't. I guess I'm not as wise as he.
Yeah,
I don't know.
yeah, it could have been something to think about. What would we expect to find archaeologically speaking if a centralized kingdom under David and Solomon really existed? Is there anything worth adding there that you haven't mentioned?
Hmm. I don't know. I think there's always a caution that archaeologists have of um, going into a site and expecting to find something, because it never works out. Um, so, just professionally, I want to be cautious saying what should we expect. But again, it depends on what you think statehood looks like. It depends on your model of statehood, of what you think would be there. And I think a lot of what we have that um, you got a lot of strong signal for statehood, even if you don't have a lot of the material market. That to me, like the settlement pattern shift is a big one. Like people people love where they live. They have traditions where they live, and you're not going to just get up and walk away from that unless somebody's telling you to, or it's not safe anymore, or the climate is shifting and it's now dry. And those are all much longer term processes than um, so we do see like certain areas become drier over time, but that's a long-term process. You see this really quite sudden settlement pattern shift. Um, and I think the really interesting thing with archaeology is a lot of times you're seeing stuff and then you're trying to understand the material, like the behavior behind the material. Um, and so fortifications, again, like that requires a lot of organization around agriculture and economy. Like that requires mobilization of people. Like there's a lot of things that go into that. Um, so there are some things that don't necessarily seem like really strong indicators of a kingdom of David or Solomon, but then I don't know, to me there's some stuff that's more persuasive, just because of the material. Like the material may not be a strong signal, but the behavior behind it is like, okay, well, something is making this behavior happen. What else could it be other than a state of some sort?
So how much time do you have?
I got a couple more minutes.
Okay.
So we got some construction going on in the house, so hopefully it's not noisy.
So you don't have like a cow in the background or something?
No, somebody's drilling something. So hopefully,
No, it's fine. You 1 Kings 9:15 says, "Here's the account of the forced labor King Solomon conscripted to build the Lord's temple, his own palace, the terraces, the wall of Jerusalem, and Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer." And coincidentally enough, we have these essentially entrances to Hatzor, Megiddo, and Gezer. You're talking about before that there was another city that was found that is similar to this or has the same structure. So it doesn't necessarily prove that this is Israel in itself. At the same time, it is really interesting that these three places and possibly Jerusalem have such strong similarities. And I want to put it on the screen. So that's the place of where they are at. And then you have they case-made walls. So little what's a good way to describe this? Like little spaces
two
between.
parallel walls with other walls sort of separating them. Is the
Yeah,
casemate. Yeah.
yeah. So they all have walls like that, which is interesting similarity there. Some have
Which actually
argued.
starts in Moab, we think.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Well, there's a biblical text. I don't know what it is. It says something like a lot of these buildings were created by this, with like Cyrus, or not Cyrus, but somewhere in the top left of this picture here, and So that's interesting. Is it's like, well, maybe these were all made by the same designer or the same group of people. Uh, not sure how true that would be or how likely. Um, but yeah, then we have a little blueprint. So a lot of similarities between these, and what you can't really see is that they are very similar in size. So like that's really interesting if I can get it. So like Hatzor and Megiddo 6.3, I think it is, and 6.4 and length. They're 4.2 and 4.2 as far as how big the doors are. It is interesting that Jerusalem isn't exactly the same in the front. I don't know what to make of that. And same thing for Gezer. They're not all identical, uh, but there's also a lot of similarities there.
Yeah, and they're also working within sort of what's already there.
Okay.
So they may not, and they may have wanted a larger gate or a smaller gate. Like you got to deal with the local topography and local history.
Mhm.
You know, Jerusalem. You know, I have more experience with Gezer. I've been there a number of times, and you know, there's Gezer is also a much larger site than Megiddo or Hatzor in the 10th century. So there's a number of things that can contribute to the size discrepancies.
Yeah, yeah. And then you have the tail dance stele, which is interesting in itself. So, did you have anything you wanted to add there as far as what it says about this discussion, other than there's probably good reason to think David existed?
Yeah, I think that you know really kind of seals if this was about any other kingdom. And we have this, the House of X is a really well known formula in Assyrian and Aramean inscriptions. The Assyrians will refer to a number of these sort of Syro-Hittite kingdoms that are now in Syria around the Euphrates. You know, they'll refer to as House of X, and we don't really doubt that those are referring to historical people. So I don't think there's any real reason to doubt that David was recognized as a person. As I'm talking earlier, there's some interesting work that's sort of again questioning. We tend to conflate House of David with the Kingdom of Judah, and there's some interesting in comparing how the Assyrians and the Arameans use terminology. That equation that we tend to assume may not be accurate, um, and that the House of David may be sort of maybe a sort of constituent part of Judah, not necessarily the totality of Judah. There's again, there's some. This is not settled. There's a lot of research about what exactly does this House of David word term mean, and you know, when you think stuff's settled, it's somebody comes along with a new interpretation. So, yeah, there's a book called The House of David, and then there's a subtitle that I can't remember that gets into this. But yeah, I think it's pretty clear that you know there was a person named David that you know Hazael or whoever is recognizing that people are you know saying they're related to him. That it's a dynastic title. So
What role does Kirbet Kayafa play in this?
yeah, Khirbet Qiyyafa is an interesting site. You know, it's got two gates, which is really weird. Where it's located, it's this really kind of interesting forward operating base, pushing towards the Philistines. Single phase site. Um, so yeah, it's interesting. It's again, it's in the it's like right near where the David and David and Goliath story is set. So there seems to be this sort of connection between that area and David, and so you know could be Davidic. That seems as good as explanation as any. It's an interesting site. I haven't dug into the archaeology quite as much. A lot of that happened after I started working on Cyprus, so I'm not up to date. I'll say that.
Yeah. So in the picture, you can see that it's really close to Philistine territory. That makes sense that it would be kind of the place
Yeah.
where David and Goliath supposedly fought, and so that's fun in itself. Some have argued that because of the fortified city with a case wall, two gates, planned urban layout, public buildings, and Astrakhan with early alphabetic writing, that this gives more credence that the area was, I guess, more developed, closer to that state role than maybe some kind of tribal thing going on. But I guess it's also, and also there's no pork bones. Or yeah, no, no
Yeah.
pig bones that were found there, so, which is distinct for Israelite often. So that's really interesting. Um, does it? I mean, how strong of evidence is this in your eyes? All that being said, for like, does it move the needle much?
Yeah, I mean, I think I don't think there's any question that it's Israelite or Judahite, whatever term you want to use. I don't think there's any question that that's what it is. I think the more, the question is it David? Or I've heard it's just it would predate David, so it would be Saul.
Hmm.
So it depends on when you date it. Depends on when you date David and Solomon. So it's just a matter of like who is doing it.
Yeah, yeah. So I know other scholars argue that it's Canaanites or
Yeah,
that it is Philistine, although it doesn't necessarily look very Philistine. So that's interesting. But yeah, so maybe we'll learn more about that later.
yeah,
Um, and it's also interesting that it shows that there is some literacy in the region, which is not we don't get that a lot around
yeah,
here.
yeah.
Um,
There's and Kirby Kaffa is not too far away from Gezer, which again you find that 10th century Gezer calendar. So that's the Kirby Kaffa with the Kirby Kaffa Astrakhan. Like it is evidence of literacy, but it's also like we're not saying geographically widespread literacy either. It's kind of an interesting point.
mhm, yeah. Yep. All right. I didn't have much to add otherwise there. Anything? Oh, yo, there's the Tel Motza temple. Okay, we have to mention that. So this is super weird. This was a temple found right outside Jerusalem, right outside it, basically, under a highway. You can see it in the picture, which is just crazy in my eyes. What's a
Yeah.
temple doing under a highway? But this is right outside of Jerusalem, which is really weird because supposedly the um, you know the Solomonic temple is supposed to be some really big thing that's in charge, and you're only supposed to go there, uh, and then it's right outside. And so, what is this time period that we have this place? It's like 1,000 to 500 BC or something like that.
Yeah, I haven't seen. I don't know if they're published fully yet. There might be some preliminary stuff out, so I'm not up to date on this. But yet they've found this temple. I think it was maybe done in a salvage excavation, so I don't think they've even. Um, I don't know that they've excavated the entire structure yet. Maybe
Okay.
they might have. But from the layout, they can tell it's from the layout and the finds. They can tell this is a cultic building. It seems to be similar layout to the what's described in Kings for the Jerusalem temple. But Motzah is right outside. It's right outside Jerusalem. So and scholars are not quite settled on this of like what the significance is. Yeah, I mean it's an open question, but there's yeah, definitely something is happening there. Something
Yeah.
religious is happening there. But the exact, what I've heard is theories are like this would have been sort of sanctioned by the the Jerusalem temple by the priesthood in Jerusalem, that this would have been a it's not like a knockoff operating. Like this would have been sanctioned. This would have been recognized. But what its relationship was to the Jerusalem temple, is not clear, and we don't really have anything from the Solomonic temple, so not really. So, it's again interesting questions that I don't know. I don't think we have great answers for yet. But again, there's something going on there. There's it would also, to me, it would suggest like, there is something going on at Jerusalem in the first, that 10th century, 9th century, it's whatever it is. There's something going on in Jerusalem. That's the larger settlement, at least later 8th century. I don't know. I don't have great answers for you. I'm just saying archaeology words.
There's so many questions about that, and maybe we'll find evidence soon. Maybe they already have found evidence, but like, does this mean that Solomon or David or whatever, or people later, were okay with another religion, or not another religion, but another god being worshipped, kind of like you have in Egypt? We got temples all over the place. Does that mean that, like, and that's what scholars argue with, like Asherah and all that stuff going on, or is it, as you say, is it sanctioned by
makes the Jerusalem only temple thing kind of a weird, like, what do we make of that?
right, exactly. So there are texts in the Bible that say, hey, we only Jerusalem. Okay, well, what about right outside it?
Is that an extension of Jerusalem in their minds? I mean, I don't know. I don't have great answers.
Right. And why do we find that right outside, but we can't find the actual temple? That's annoying. But anyways, thank you so much for coming on here. Really fun. Any last thoughts?
It. No, thank you for having me. I have a great time. A lot of fun. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Yep. And check out Beneath the Bible, where there are going to be videos in like 6 years or something, but they're going to be really good. And you got to make sure you watch the other previous ones too. So that'll give you some time to catch up before the next one. But anyways, thanks so much for coming on, everybody. Like and subscribe. Check out both channels here, and otherwise, well, have a good one, guys.